Okay, so here we go. Good evening again, everybody. Daughters of Emptiness. We're going to talk about poems from millennia of enlightened women this evening. Continue the conversation. So this is the book of Chinese women. The other one we're doing is Indian women. I'm going to start though. The basic theme of this is there is a paucity of female voices in the canon of enlightened women, and that's particularly true and specifically true from the perspective of what I'm talking about here. As we look back in history, we look back at the contemporaries of Buddha, and we look at the lineages coming forward through China in this case, but also Japan. But it's true in contemporary terms. It's something that, as we know, there are a lot more women teachers out there right now. But if we look at the last several decades, and you look at the crowd who went to India and Myanmar and Thailand and Japan and all the rest, they didn't encounter a lot of female teachers. There's a couple of people though who I do want to bring up as we go through this, and one of them is this person, Dipa Ma. Dipa Ma, you've probably heard of. Dipa Ma is, she's actually born in Bangladesh. She had a lot of her teaching in Burma, Myanmar, and she went back to India to teach. I own this book because Beth bought this and read this book and said, wow! So, and I've known of Dipa Ma for many years, I've just never read her. And I've never read her because there's not much out there. This is it, just this one little book. So, but she's astonishing. This book has a foreword by Sharon Salzberg, an introduction by Joseph Goldstein, and afterward by Jack Cornfield, who are like the gang of three who founded Insight Meditation. If you look at the list of contributors at the back of the book, there's 4 or 5 pages. Well, there's more than that, 6 or 8 pages of contributors, and it's kind of a who's who of late 20th, early 21st century Buddhism in the West. Silver Borstein's in here, there's a whole bunch of people. So she's a remarkable woman, and her story is, very briefly her story, as I'm going to butcher it, but crude outline. She was raised in basically a Buddhist culture, so she was used to ritual and the practices of Buddhism. And she practiced them. There was a lot of traditional woman's stuff in the home she was just not interested in. She was much more interested in sort of hanging out and making donations to the monks and practicing generosity in the precepts, basically. So, as was traditional, and she was also very interested in school and study and learning, which struck people who knew her as very odd, because that's not something young girls usually did in that culture. So when she was 12, she was married off. And this was obviously against her interests, but that happened. She went to live with her in-laws, and her husband went off to run his job in what they called at the time Burma, Myanmar. So she basically lived with her in-laws as kind of a stranger in her own home, and she was very unhappy. A few years later, she went off to Rangoon to live with her husband. She didn't know the language, didn't know the culture. Her husband was working very hard, still very lonely. Her husband was very kind to her, and she regarded him as her first great teacher. But the pressure was to have a child, and that didn't happen. So her husband was advised by family to leave her and take another wife, and he refused, so he was loyal. But this was miserable for this poor woman who was to become Dipa Ma. So eventually, a couple of decades down the road, she had a first child who died. She had a second child who died, and she was getting sick and miserable and really unhappy along the way. So around about the age of 40, she had her third child, a girl called Ma. She became very sick, bedridden. Her husband came home, started to stay at home to look after her, but he died because this was just so overwhelmingly sad and depressing, and so much domestic pressure. So this is one of those classic stories of a follower of the Dharma who was not a real practitioner, but somebody who was believed in the Dharma and for whom this was important, who had lost everybody and everything. Her family was gone, was left behind. She'd had children who had all died. Her husband had died. Just awful. So finally, in her 40s, she gets to go on a retreat. And 5 days into the retreat, she wakes up. So she was being taught in the tradition of Mahasi Sayadaw, who was the great teacher of that tradition, Myanmar at the time, and Munindra Ji was her personal teacher, who was in that lineage. So there are 4 levels of awakening, and she progressed through them all very quickly. Then went back, and she became just a widely recognised teacher. And she's a householder. She's raising a child, living at home, doing the kitchen, cooking, laundry, hanging out the clothes. She'll go sit for a little bit, and then she'll offer these profound teachings to people. And then she'll just carry on with the laundry, and somebody will visit, and she'll just look at them with just this boundless, open heart of compassion. Munindra Ji, before she left him, he taught her the siddhis, which are the mystical powers, and they talked about in in the Pali Canon. Buddha, it's written in many places. I don't know how many, but it's a lot of places. Buddha's hanging around in northern India, and he realizes one of his followers halfway across this vast country is struggling or is doing something they shouldn't do. And as a strong man would flex his arm, Buddha appeared in front of this person. This is just every day in the canon. As a strong man would flex his arm, Buddha teleported across half of India and showed up and taught this guy. So the siddhis, they've listed them here, where are we? Dematerializing, body doubling, cooking without fire, mind reading, visitation of the heaven and hell realms. That's another thing Buddha did. He'd go visit all the devas and the devils and all the people who were in these places and talk to them. Time travel, knowledge of past lives, and more. Munindra taught her in this stuff. And you have a book here written by Amy Schmidt, who is very prominent in the Insight tradition, these passages by Salzburg, Goldstein and Caulfield, which are talking about how Dipa Ma would just show up to meetings with people by just disappearing and appearing in the room. Goldstein has, elsewhere I've read Goldstein talking about, he's just sitting in his little study room, his hut, in wherever he was working with her, and she would just, poof, she'd just appear floating in the air outside his room, laughing, and then she'd disappear again. So there's something playful. You've got to be careful with the siddhis, but it's been recognised throughout, in the Lotus Sutras, Patanjali talks about them. Anyway, I'm not saying you have to believe it, but this is, you can't get anything more credible than a book with all of these credits in it. However you cut it, just a remarkable human being and a really profound teacher. And here we are. This is it. This is incredibly valuable, but this is it. This is a lifetime of work by Amy Schmidt trying to figure out everything she could about this teacher. Nothing written down. So, on to China, or back to China. So this is a really wonderful book. There's a lovely introduction to it that talks about the history and how this author, Beata Grant, pulled this together and the research she did and the broader history. And then she breaks them down, the individual women down over time periods. So we're going to look at some of the earlier ones. There's a period of time here it's called the 6 Dynasties, from 220 to 581. She has found precisely one woman in this time frame. So we'll look at this woman. This woman became, clearly a very a deeply enlightened woman, profoundly realized person who became really well recognized as a teacher. She taught the emperor. The emperor himself had a convent built for her and her community of nuns. So there's a real history here. Obviously not a history that's as strong as the male history, but there was a real female practice and community. But none of this stuff was written down or recognized. Just little bits. So he got her to come and teach him. He built her a convent. He wanted her to come and do more, and she ended up just staying with the nuns for a lot and died there. Here's the one poem that we have by her. Worldly people who do not understand me call me by my worldly name of Old Shoe. You invite me to a 7-day religious feast, but the feast of meditation knows no end. So we'll skip to the Tang Dynasty. The Tang Dynasty was the heyday of Chinese Zen. And you've got all these crusty male monks wandering around with bushy eyebrows and cutting cats in half and being crusty to each other and walking halfway across China with their straw sandals on their heads. And scattered among them there are a few women. Here's one poem I like. It's by Plum Blossom Nun. Nothing is known about this nun. She may well be a fabrication. However, the poem she is said to have written is very famous and often included in anthologies. Here we go. The entire day, and I'm going to show you this. If you look on the screen, you can see on the side here, there's a block. And that block, is that shown up on the screen? It's like 5 by 4. So these are very symmetrical poems. And if you look at that one on the other page, it's like 10 rows of... There you go. It's like 10 rows of 4 characters. So you can imagine in the mother language, these would be beautifully symmetrical poems, very metered and well structured. It doesn't come across that way in English, but 8 rows of 5, and this one's 4 rows of 8, 4 rows of 7. The entire day I searched for spring, but spring I could not find. In my straw sandals I tramped among the mountain peak clouds. Home again, smiling, I finger a sprig of fragrant plum blossom. Spring was right here on these branches in all of its glory. So this has kind of the flavor of the Japanese haiku, right? It's just there in nature.
Could you read it again, please?
Yes, absolutely. The entire day I searched for spring, but spring I could not find. In my straw sandals I tramped among the mountain peak clouds. Home again smiling, I finger a sprig of fragrant plum blossom. Spring was right here on these branches in all of its glory. So we're still in the Tang Dynasty. No, we're not. We're in the Sung Dynasty with the next one. So the Tang Dynasty, that 350 years, we have 3 people we've captured. The next 300 years, we've got a few more. Miashong was quite prolific, granddaughter of a prime minister. She practiced in the Linji, which is Linji is also known as Rinzai, so that's what he was the founder of one of the major Japanese lineages of Zen. So she practiced with one of the great teachers in that lineage, and she also wrote poems on the koans that were to become, by a later teacher, Yuan Wu, they were to become collected and become the Blue Cliff Records. So when those were first around as stories and as koans, she was writing poems that were commentaries on these, and a lot of those survive. 43 of the poetic commentaries remain extant today. So I'll read 2 of her poems. A leaf of a boat drifts across the endless expanse of water, lifting and dancing the oars to a different melody now. Clouds on the mountain, moon over the sea, all tossed away. This done, Chuangshu's butterfly dream will last forever. So a couple of comments on that, because we're now moving into the literary age of a lot of this Chinese stuff, and this is something when we read the koan commentaries, it's really helpful to have a flavor of this. These poems reference the culture and the history of the poems and the stories around the poems. So I won't relate the whole story, and I don't pretend to know the whole story about the boat and the oars, but it's something along the lines of a woman said to a boatsman, I've had 7 children and blah blah blah, and what's the truth? And he just smacked her upside the head with the oar. So she said, 6 of my children have already drowned, here's my 7th, and she just throws the child into the water, which is not meant to be read literally. And one of the mistakes we make with koans is we read them literally. This is metaphorical, and it's, the children represent attachments and illusions and being hit in that way by somebody. It's kind of a turning word, and it loosens that last attachment, so now we're crossing the water, and so there's this flavour to it all. And the butterfly dream, Chuangzhu's butterfly dream, you're probably familiar with this story broadly. Somebody goes to sleep and dreams they're a butterfly, and then they wake up and they wonder if they're a butterfly dreaming and they're a human. So are they a human who dream they're a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming they're a human, and or both, or neither? What's true? There's beauty in that, just that poetic irresolution. So that's the last line. So I'll read that one again. A leaf of a boat drifts across the endless expanse of water, lifting and dancing the oars to a different melody now, which is presumably after that enlightenment experience. Clouds on the mountain, moon over the sea, all tossed away. This done, Chuangzhu's butterfly dream will last forever. So one more from Miao Song. Suddenly I have made contact with the tip of the nose, and my cleverness melts like ice and shatters like tiles. What need for Bodhidharma to come from the West? What a waste for the second patriarch to have paid his respects. To ask any further about what this is and what is that, to ask any further about what is this and what is that would signal defeat by a regiment of straw bandits. So a regiment, and a brief commentary and then I'll read it again. A regiment of straw bandits is obviously fantasy, right? There's no power in there, so they have no power over you at all. What need for Bodhidharma to have come from the West? That is the famous line in koans. It's, why did Bodhidharma come from the West? Well, there wouldn't be any Chan in China or Zen in Japan if he hadn't done, but why did he come, and did it actually make a difference? It's an answerless question. And it's a koan, in one way you get the truth, and that itself is an awakening. The second patriarch was the one who went to Bodhidharma, stood outside in the snow, cut his arm off to show his sincerity. He said to when Bodhidharma would accept him and receive a question, he said to Bodhidharma, I can't stop my mind, will you help me stop my mind? And Bodhidharma said, show me your mind and I will stop it. This flummoxed him, he went away and he came back and said, I can't find my mind. And Bodhidharma said, there, I've quietened it for you. But paying his respects was cutting his arm off in order to be greeted and be recognized by Bodhidharma. So I'll read it again. Suddenly I have made contact with the tip of the nose, and my cleverness melts like ice and shatters like tiles. What need for Bodhidharma to come from the West? What a waste for the second patriarch to have paid his respects. To ask any further about what is this and what is that would signal defeat by a regiment of straw bandits. That would fit really beautifully in one of those classic koan collections. The last one I'm going to read is from Dharma heir of there were real Dharma heirs. She was recognized as having been transmitted by Yuan Wu, who was the person who actually put together the Blue Cliff record. He's the person whose name is on there. He assembled all these poems. He took the poems and the verses that had been assembled, and he wrote his commentary and all his little footnotes on the poems and the koans. So we don't know much about this person, except that she was an heir of him, and she was real. So here are a couple of poems by her. I'll read. each of them. I'll read the first one, then pause, and then I'll read the second one. Don't you know that afflictions are nothing more than wisdom? But to cling to your afflictions is nothing more than foolishness. As they rise and then melt away again, you must remember this. The sparrowhawk flies through Sila without anyone noticing. Sila is a valley in Korea, and the sparrowhawk flying is just it's a metaphor for swiftness and for invisibility. You've got to be really quick to see a sparrowhawk. Sparrowhawks are really fast. They catch sparrows in flight. They're really fast, and they're not very large. So this is a metaphor for speed and for you having to be really attentive to actually notice. Don't you know that afflictions are nothing more than wisdom? But to cling to your afflictions is nothing more than foolishness. As they rise and then melt away again, you must remember this. The sparrowhawk flies through Sila without anyone noticing. Last poem I'll read, and then we'll pause. We'll stop. I'll stop, and then we'll talk together. Don't you know that afflictions are nothing more than wisdom? And that the purest of blossoms emerges from the mire? If someone were to come and ask me what I do, after eating my gruel and rice, I wash my bowl. Don't worry about a thing. Don't worry about a thing. You may play all day like a silly child in the sand by the sea, but you must always realize the truth of your original face. When you suffer the blows delivered by the patriarch's staff, if you can't say anything, you will perish by the staff. If you can say something, you will perish by the staff. In the end, what will you do? If you are forbidden to travel by night, but must arrive by dawn. So I'll pass that a little bit and then read it again. This is my favourite of the bunch, but it's also in many ways the most opaque and the most entangled with the culture of the koans and the literary history of the time, which I happen to love, and I've spent way too much time reading it over the years. So it begins the same way as the last one. Don't you know that afflictions are nothing more than wisdom? And that the purest of blossoms emerges from the mire. Of course, that's the lotus emerging from the mud. If someone were to come and ask me what I do, after eating my gruel and rice, I wash my bowl. That's a reference to a specific koan involving Joshu. When somebody comes and says, I'm new here, what should I do? And he says, have you eaten your food? Yes. Then go wash your bowl. Have you eaten your food is kind of a metaphor, and these things are not to be taken either literally or as metaphors. They are to be taken as truth on their own terms, and held as truth in their own terms, and we become unified with them. So by using these in the poem as poetic language, the poet, Benming, is here placing the poems in that same way, that we have to embody the poems, we have to become the poem, we have to really take the poem in and let go of everything else. So she's putting us in that place by the way she's just continuing to come back to these kind of reference which are out of that culture. But the koan, the metaphors around the koan, to the extent they're useful, are have you eaten your food, eaten your gruel? Well, the gruel is the teaching, the gruel is the practice. Have you done your practice? Yes. Then go clean your bowl. Clean the mind. Get empty. Let go. Don't worry about a thing. Don't worry about a thing. You may play all day like a silly child in the sand by the sea. The Lotus Sutra was the most influential sutra in Chinese Buddhism, the most influential sutra in Japanese Buddhism. Half of Dogen is a commentary on the Lotus Sutra. One of the stories in there, talking in if children playing in the sand by the sea are making offerings to the Buddhas just as much as people doing prostrations in front of stupas. But you must always realize the truth of your original face. Interestingly, what's his name? My lineage. Ajahn Chah. Ajahn Chah, early in one of his books, he talks about seeing your original face. We think of it as a Zen term, and exclusively a Zen term, but he talks of true nature and original face. Seeing your original face. What is your original face? Your face before your mother was born. When you suffer the blows delivered by the patriarch's staff, if you can't say anything, you will perish by the staff. If you can say something, you will perish by the staff. There is no possible logical response. Waking up is not a matter of cause and effect. Life, true life, is not cause and effect. It is beyond logical, beyond that. It's something else. So in the end, what will you do? And framed in this way, at the time it was illegal to travel by night. So what will you do if you are forbidden to travel by night, but you must arrive by dawn? Another way of setting up an impossible problem. What will you do? Joshua, when presented with this, put his sandal on his head and turned around and walked away. Masu went, "Quats!" And Lynchy would just smack people with his stick. What would you do? Alright, that's enough from me.